Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the rise of hybrid warfare, growing attacks on critical infrastructure right across Europe, energy insecurity, and of course, regulatory pressure. And that's not to mention America's long term strategic pivot from Europe to the Indo Pacific region. This has changed the operating environment for all European companies. And geopolitical risk is no longer something that executives just need to monitor. It's something that boards, executive teams, investors, and senior management have to understand. They've got to be preparing for, and they must be governing. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International Risk Podcast. And today we're joined by Federico Saleri. He's the Associate Director in the European Geopolitical and Country Risk team at Control Risks. And they're one of the world's leading geopolitical and security risk consultancies. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Federico today. Federico, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Whereabouts in the world are you today?
I'm sitting in London, and to say I am melting. It's touching 30 degrees already, and it's not even 10 a.m. So yeah, I think by the time we're finishing the conversation, I think my wife we're gonna have to put me back into the freezer for a few hours so I can recompose myself and keep being. But I guess we're going to be talking about resilience today and ability to adapt. No ability to adapt whatsoever to these temperatures here.
I think our friends in the White House, Pete Hegseth and others, might just call Europeans weak. Just weak. Can't handle the heat. But
I mean, we just survived the NATO summit, the Ankara summit. So I think, I guess we can be relieved a little bit. Obviously, you started with a full host and list of issues that we're facing at the moment, that our clients are facing, businesses are facing. But when it comes to this week, I guess we are a bit unscathed from the conversations that happened in Ankara. I mean, Ukraine is getting away with potentially the ability to produce Patriots.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
No, it's only veiled threats on Greenland, minor, a few threats to Spain and so forth. I guess that's, we can probably be relieved. At least NATO is fundamentally still intact. Although just a few days ago, and I think this also speaks to the broader landscape, we're leaving NATO, but I think another very interesting episode that happened this week was the reversal of that famous red card in the World Cup, which I find it to be quite indicative of how international relations are. I mean, everybody sort of knows what the rules are and what the rules have been, but following the rules is a whole other game, and all it takes is one phone call. So I guess international relations now hinge on interpersonal relations when you want to get things done.
It's very interesting. It really is. There's so many different takes of that. But yeah, I think that's a great analogy or a great example of where someone was given a red card, whether you agree to it or not. There's rules, and we all accept them, and we move on, and we accept whether our team wins or loses and who's sent off. But then when the big kid Donald Trump jumps in, all of a sudden those rules start getting reversed, and we see that with you or I, if we stole a stapler or a mouse from our workplace, we'd be fired, and that would be fair enough. We stole something from the workplace. And yet, certain administrations can be given jets. They can be turned into Air Force One, but then when they leave office, they can take it with them. It's just really quite interesting. I was having this conversation with my son the other day. It's really quite interesting the different rules that apply to different people and how they're interpreted, and that flows into geopolitics, certainly.
Yeah, and just continuing with the analogy with. I mean, I'm not sure where the UK, when England is when trying to reverse the red card, but I remember this week there were conversations about England trying to appeal as well on their own red card, because it happened once, why not making it happen again? And I think, again, starting in 2026, there have been many such episodes where the rule makers now are not abiding by the rules that they are making, and the rule takers now can look at opportunities to exploit that situation.
Yeah, very much so. And I think these assumptions and these beliefs that we've had about how the world operates, how sports operates, how business operates, one of the assumptions, one of the key assumptions has always been that, geopolitics and international relations matters, but it's something that happens in the background. And I think, we've also assumed that the United States has always underwritten European security, and it has. underwritten European security. It's not just an assumption, it's a fact. Europe has underwritten European security. I was in Ukraine at the time last year when America actually pooled its support for Ukraine, the intelligence support. And I remember speaking to soldiers on the front line, and it was catastrophic. And I said, but what about the French? What about the British? You're getting heaps of support from them. And they said, no, only America has the intelligence platforms that assist us with targeting. Effectively, when we look deep into the front lines, like on the other side of Russian territory or Russian occupied territory of Ukraine, we're simply blind. America is the only country that has that intelligence. So unquestionably, Europe has relied on America. We've also assumed that supply chains were optimized for efficiency, and that was a good thing. And energy was treated as just a commercial input, not a vulnerability, but just a commercial input. And I think even when there was geopolitical crisis and everyone paid attention, whether it was fuel shocks or financial crisis or tensions between countries, these were always seen as temporary shocks, not as persisting operating conditions. So I'd be keen. Is this something that you're seeing with your clients? And Control Risks has an amazing portfolio of clients and companies, and I know you work with a lot of them. Are you seeing that executive teams get this? They understand that the assumptions that they grew up with when they were middle management aren't the same assumptions they can use when they're running companies?
You're right. Like temporary shocks are not just temporary anymore. And the shocks that we're talking about for the past 6 years, the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia full-scale invasion of Ukraine, followed by the energy crisis, Trump's elections or Trump 2.0 presidency that's sort of rewriting the rules. Again, it goes hand in hand with some of the major consultancies reports that list geopolitical with when they interview executives. They obviously geopolitical risk is now at the forefront of their agenda, and I think this is exactly it. It's a matter of learning how to deal with outlier scenarios. We're now facing one outlier scenario after another, meaning preparing for short-term shocks doesn't cut it anymore. And I think this is where not necessarily just the potential, and a lot of the conversations that we're having at the moment with our clients here in Europe, obviously we're talking about the potential for Russia escalating against NATO or escalating against European NATO, what the response would be, whether the United States would show up if one of the Baltic countries, for example, calls for Article 5. But we're talking about those macro scenarios, and at the same time, again, there's also very, very specific incidents that are occurring across Europe that are symptomatic of companies needing to be ready to deal with outliers. And I think one of the main example that we faced was, first week in January, we've had Venezuela, but at the same time, our colleagues in Berlin woke up. I don't know if I remember if it was the 3rd or the 6th of January. They woke up and there was no electricity in some parts of Berlin as a result of a sabotage attack that was allegedly or confirmed perpetrated by radical activists. And suddenly 40,000 households in the German capital were left without electricity for, I think, 2 or 3 days. This is just, is the world we live in. Is the type of shocks that we now face regularly and that companies need to know how to deal with.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because we would assume a country like Germany, one of the most developed countries in the world, in Berlin, one of the biggest and most impressive cities globally, that we wouldn't have 2,000 businesses and, as you said, thousands of households that would lose electricity like that. It's something that if we had that conversation with many executive teams and said, what would you do? What's your business continuity plan? There'd be a roll of the eyes and like, oh, you're just trying to drum up business. And I wonder, what do you think has changed more? Is it the actual strategic landscape and the risk landscape has changed? Or is it that the level of awareness amongst business leaders has changed, or even the consequences of getting it wrong, which of course, I mean, things just go like lightning. We saw yesterday Donald Trump called Zelensky Putin, and in the same sentence he referred to the Islamic Republic of Japan bombing ships in the Strait of Hormuz, which of course wasn't the Islamic Republic of Japan. But things get wrong and they go across social media immediately, and CEOs are so scared. But what do you think the biggest one is? People worried about getting it wrong, the increase in level of awareness, or just the changing environment?
I think I was at an event recently where some of the panelists said, well, if you're concerned about resilience, wait to see how we're doing with readiness here in the UK, which get a bit daunting. I think it's we can I can maybe try to address it into two different ways. I mean, first of all, the geopolitical risk. What does it actually mean? So companies now that face geopolitical risk, they are learning now how to define it properly in a way that they understand how that can sort of cascade down to the impact that this geopolitical risk as an umbrella term will have to their business. This is becoming more and more evident now, especially here in Europe, because as you said, the threat landscape has changed massively over the past 2 years. I mean, let alone the shock that comes from Russia invading Ukraine, but the the whole kind of a gray zone aggression scenarios that we're actively living in here in Europe. That I don't think companies, governments, I mean, governments hopefully have realized it by now, but I don't think businesses have fully realized, and the population have not realized the full scale of what we're facing. I mean, there have been, as a result of Europe pulling together to support Ukraine, there have been an increase in Russia we call hybrid warfare, gray zone aggression, active measure tactics against Europe, against European countries to sort of deter them from supporting Ukraine. But the scale of it is something that is I don't think is familiar to many. And again, we have conversations because obviously we read the news, and we look at the data sets, we look at the organizations that try and collect all the information around all those incidents that happen in a kinetic space. I'm not going to touch on the cyber domain because there's a whole other issue. But if we talk about the kinetic space, obviously we have, if I remember correctly, the Associated Press and Emma Burrow's team that is doing a fantastic job in mapping all the incidents that are happening across Europe that are directly correlated or tied to Russia. But for example, speaking to a client, and I'm talking like about 1 year ago, the DHL incidents that have been occurring in Europe, the warehouses catching fire, and so forth. If you start counting them, all the ones that are reported, we can probably find about 20, 25, more or less. Talking to a client in the logistics sector, and that was, again, Q1 of last year, they intercepted about 300 parcel bombs in just one country in Europe. So we're dealing with what's reported, and we're dealing with the sort of the anecdotal and what we're told. And this again is just last year. We are facing increasingly bold attacks that are most likely perpetrated by Russia. And what I mean by boldness, I mean we received information that, for example, there was tampering in again one leading country in Europe of the signaling of a single railway
Yep.
that temporarily gave the green light to two trains coming towards each other. I mean, so the acceptance of risk and the acceptance of potentially causing mass casualties as part of this hybrid warfare campaign or gray zone aggression campaign has also increased. So it's not just a matter. There's an increase in pace, intensity, frequency of such attacks, and that poses the question. I mean, the proliferation of drones. Does it really matter now if you're a company obviously facing or working you operate in critical infrastructure and there's a drone flying, a commercial drone flying over your head? How do you distinguish whether that's a proxy that has been paid £100 or to fly the drone, or is kind of a little Timmy playing with the drone?
Mm.
You still don't know whether the drone is recording, whether this recording is going to go, who's going to get access to that recording, and so forth. So now, instead of dealing with likelihoods, as I said, companies and executives now deal with outliers more and have to take into consideration outlier scenarios more. Looking at those kind of escalatory scenarios is not much about likelihood of a scenario happening, but focusing on the impact that, regardless of the situation we're in, looking at the impact of those attacks, direct, indirect, and so forth.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. And you mentioned the logistics industry, and I think that's a really great example. We know I spent a lot of time in Ukraine, but we know that Russia's war against Ukraine is not confined to just the battlefield, and we know that European companies are exposed to a much wider set of risks: energy insecurity, cyber threats, supply chain disruptions, disinformation is significant, infrastructure vulnerabilities you spoke about, and just this grey zone activity that deliberately sits below this threshold of conventional war. But if you're the company or you're the government agency that's the victim of it, it is still very, very painful. Now, I know that a lot of your work has focused on hybrid warfare and the grey zone activity and the spillover from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Are European businesses part of the battle space today, even when they're not the direct targets?
Yes, I mean
Mm.
the answer is yes, right? When so I've had the luxury as part of my work to travel across Europe this year to present control risk map, which is our annual kind of geopolitical risk forecast with our top 5 risks and so forth. So I've traveled in the Nordic countries. I was in Helsinki. I was in Stockholm, but I also traveled to Italy. I guess if my name didn't give it away, I'm also Italian. Um, so, and I had the chance to present these issues and talk about these issues to our clients there. And the threat perception varies significantly. If you're in Helsinki, there is a sense of readiness and preparedness. They've been, you ask a Finnish business, are you ready to face the potential for an escalation in the country? The answer is yes. We've been ready for 70 years. If you go to Italy, this is going to, the argument is going to be dismissed very, very quickly. And that speaks to the level of responsibilities that companies feel having, and then they actually have. Well, on the one hand, probably because they're told, and because of that cultural mindset that a company needs to sustain or need to be civil defense ready, as opposed to obviously in a country where you're more detached from it, where civil defense isn't really a conversation, and even nowadays is not a conversation. And that speaks to the conversation that has not happened, or is it kind of is now increasingly happening because obviously the threat is becoming more blatant. But who's responsible for it? Is it the government responsible for defending critical infrastructure, or is the company itself responsible for defending critical infrastructure? And conversations we were having 2 years ago, it was the Spider-Man meme where they all point at each other. That was the conversation. It's like, is it you? Is it me? I mean, we're now defending against threat from the state. It should be you, the government, to provide that support. But at the same time, the expectation on government is actually no. You have to have your house in order and be ready to defend yourself. But what investing in resilience is such a hard conversation to have if you're in corporate security, or again you work in resilience. It costs a lot of money, and it is that different goal that government has compared to businesses. And I think there's still a bit of a lack of understanding that a business sole purpose is making money and be profitable. So investing in resilience is a cost that is going to affect potentially efficiency. So unless the government comes in and the institutions come in the European Union now with the critical entity resilience, DORA, and so forth, unless they force a business to shift that cost benefit calculation, it is going to be the business is not going to go and suddenly invest millions of pounds, dollars, euros in securing its business when the threat is not real, or
Yeah,
unless it's mandated.
definitely. Yeah, I like your point. One of my favorite questions to ask when there's a multi-stakeholder meeting is, who owns this risk? Who is responsible for identifying, managing, analyzing, and treating this risk? And you see a huge difference when a company or a group of companies, there's very clear ownership versus ones where like, well, I'm not sure. And it really is an instantaneous testament to the maturity. And it's not a criticism; it's just a very clear reflection of the maturity of the stakeholders in the room if they can own that. And you talked about the different countries and how they're prepared. I love it as well when you've got companies, that multinational companies with operations all over the world and all over Europe, and you see the Spanish and Italian teams are normally a little bit more relaxed about it, but you speak to the Finns or the Latvians or the Estonians, they're like, no, we've got crisis management plans, we practice them every quarter, we've got business continuity, we've got these systems in place. They are the extreme professionals. It's really interesting, the dichotomy between different cultures and countries.
And on this, actually, you're making a really good point. I mean, the Baltic countries, they, from our standpoint, and one thing that we've noticed over the past few years is a lot of requests that come our way from clients in Western and Central Europe are off the back of our clients' subsidiaries in the Baltics. They're feeling the threat. They know the threat is real, and therefore they're asking the question, as our employer, what are you doing to protect us? And the question goes to the HQ, whether it's in France, in Germany, in the UK, and there is a bit of a sense check as well. So they come to us for validation, and we tend to say, yes, actually the threat is real. If you look at all the incidents that are happening and the say how the situation is also changing from a threat standpoint, Russia's intent, capability, looking for opportunity, and so forth. But this has been very, very interesting. As I said, Baltics, they've some of them they've had it sorted for quite some time. But at the same time, if you're, for example, in Lithuania now, if you're a business, you need to. They're now actively thinking about, okay, where do we put shelters, or do we have to put or install bomb shelters? It's not an easy conversation to have. It's not an easy conversation to bring to your manager or to the person that sits in HQ, and at the same time, the person that sits at HQ needs to have that conversation with the leadership. So there's a lot of sense checking, but the fact that these countries are driving this, hopefully, again, a bit of wishful thinking here, but hopefully everybody else follows. But for sure, the burden sharing is very uneven and will be uneven, regardless of what happens.
I'd love to ask you a little bit more about sense checking, but before I do, Federico, I'll just remind our listeners, for those of you that prefer to watch your podcasts, the International Risk Podcast is always available on YouTube. So please do go to YouTube and search for the International Risk Podcast and do subscribe and like our content. It makes such a big impact on us finding new listeners and growing the podcast so we can continue to bring you the best possible guests. Now, Federico, we know that all sectors are being targeted by foreign adversaries, but also by organised criminal groups across Europe. Now, I've been supporting clients in government, transportation, digital infrastructure, finance, and manufacturing sectors. And, I'm seeing it across all sectors, but certainly some sectors are more impacted than others. And even the Centre for Strategic Studies noted that Russian sabotage and subversion nearly tripled in Europe between 2023 and 2024. But I'd love to do the sense checking. What are you seeing? What sectors are most exposed? Is it energy? Is it logistics, telco, finance, transport, critical infrastructure? Where are you seeing the biggest concerns?
You've named them all effectively. One, we can split between the government-related targets and assets, so anything that pertains to the military. We can talk about obviously defense, particularly those companies that are actively supporting Ukraine, and logistics is a key one. I mean, railways everywhere around Europe has been the main target. We've seen there's been a huge spike in those incidents across Europe. Poland was September, October, where there was an IED on the railway that exploded. It was around the same time where Russian drones also entered into Poland. Telecommunications, we're still, everybody also points at, the data center sector. We haven't necessarily seen threats or talked to clients that are openly disclosing incidents affecting data centers, but there's always the adjacency risk. So your substation near the airport, the Heathrow incident last year. Again, I guess the timing was interesting, even though obviously the reason for it was outdated critical infrastructure. But there is virtually no distinction. But in terms of no distinctions in terms of sectors that are impacted, everybody can be affected because of, again, adjacency and proximity. It doesn't really matter if you're resilient, but if you happen not to have a generator, just like now all Ukrainian businesses have, if a left-wing extremist conduct or cuts a cable or there's a kind of an arson attack, power is down, and you're also going to be affected. And I mean, you mentioned organized criminal groups. I think I would put them all in the same basket as radical activists to some extent, because there's been an increased acceptance of the use of violence to advance demands, and at the same time, again, whilst we cannot necessarily corroborate this, but also the enablement or the enabling from Russian intelligence or Russia state or in general to sort of show that those attacks are possible. And therefore it acts as it fuels and incentivizes other other threat actors that are maybe less capable to conduct attacks, because now we know our infrastructure is vulnerable. You don't really need much to cause huge disruptions. There was an incident recently, again reported in the German media. Was it's got a railway bridge that was used to primarily to transport weaponry. It's been there for many decades, been damaged twice over the past year. Damaged first with I think it was a small boat or a vessel that just crashed into it. And then a few weeks later, another vessel crashed into the thing that was built to replace it. So yeah, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And there's virtually no distinction. So if you're a business and you operate in the finance sector, in the energy sector, telecom sector, and so forth, you have to do your homework or making sure that you have your house in order.
And I guess doing your homework and making sure your house is in order requires that motivation, that belief that you need to focus on this. And most of us are busy. Most of us have got more than enough work to keep us busy during our business hours. And often it surprises me still, with clients in the energy sector and telco, there's still some people within these companies that, go, surely this is just hyperbolic. There's not really a threat facing us. So, you've given some great examples, but I wonder if you can help us unpack that about, what does it mean in practical business terms when we know that there's threat actors, whether they're organized crime, whether they're activist groups, whether they're nation states, and they're more willing to use violence and they're more willing to demonstrate that they're going to interfere in election processes or they're going to interfere in the social contract and the social fabric that makes our societies work so well. And how has the situation and the threat environment changed over the last few years?
It has changed. I think the key distinction that we're seeing between those companies that are actively working towards achieving readiness and resilience, the key distinction has been the mandate is coming from the top. So to be successful, you need to have a strong mandate, and that usually comes from a board member or a C-level executive. Once you have that, you can start talking about geopolitical risk more broadly within the organization. I think you earlier touched upon the sort of who's responsible for managing risks and so forth. As risk professionals, we're all familiar with the RACI matrix. So once you've identified the risk, identified also who's responsible and accountable for managing the risk. The piece of work that we have been doing that is proving successful is really, I've mentioned scenarios, but working on those scenarios, defining what the impact is. So looking at those outlier scenarios, for example, here in Europe, recently worked obviously with a client to develop increasingly escalatory scenarios in relation to kind of a Russia's potential invasion or kind of a military conflict, but also at the same time looking at widespread power outage. And once you start building these scenarios, you have these conversations with the client. When you have the mandate, you also have the right people in the room that you can consult in a workshop.
Yeah, the fact that there are so many unanswered questions, and the one thing that we are sure is that there is just a continual state of volatility, and what might be called a perma-crisis is certainly something that I'm sure will keep you and probably me employed for the foreseeable future, notwithstanding artificial intelligence. But Federico, thank you very much for coming on the International Risk Podcast today. Well, that was a great conversation with Federico Saleri from Control Risks, and I really appreciated hearing his thoughts on corporate readiness and how organizations are actually preparing for geopolitical crisis today. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Archie Saint. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening to the International Risk Podcast. We'll speak again in the next couple of days.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the International Risk Podcast. For more episodes and articles, visit theinternationalriskpodcast.com. Follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky and Instagram for the latest updates and to ask your questions to our host, Dominic Bowen. See you next time.